side do you take in the war between science and religion? Do you have a side? If you do, it's based on a lie. And I'm here to explain why. Welcome to the All Roads Lead to Rome podcast. I'm Dr. Bickford, and I'll be your guide for today. In this episode, we're going to talk about religion and science and how the two really aren't at war with each other. Pope St. John Paul II wrote, "Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth. In a word, to know himself. So that by knowing and loving God, men and women may come to the fullness of truth about themselves." That's from his papal encyclical Fides et Ratio. But wait, isn't there a war going on between science and religion? Aren't we supposed to pick one side and ignore the other? Well, let's explore that. There's two parts to that fight, one in Europe and one in the U.S. I'm going to stay focused on the one in the U.S. because a lot of the bad assumptions people have today come from this example I'm about to give you. And it happened in the 19th century. Two angry books were published by two different men for very different reasons. If we're to get to the truth about this war, then we need to start there. The first book was called A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And it was written by John William Draper in 1874. He was born in England and was the son of a Methodist minister. The family had been Catholic, but his father converted and became a Protestant minister, and this caused the Catholic family to disown them. When his father died, Draper's mother moved the family to Virginia. Draper went to school and had a distinguished academic career in science and was actually the first president of the American Chemical Society. He was also a fairly devout Protestant, and he argued that Protestantism was the twin sister of science. He argued the two worked hand in hand to make the world better. On the other hand, the greatest impediment to human advancement, he argued, was the Roman Catholic Church. And he had scientific arguments to back this up. I'll give you one example just so you can see the caliber of his arguments. To prove his point, Draper argued that naturally, national populations should double about every 25 years. In the United States, this is exactly what happened from 1850 to 1875. On the other hand, the population of England was fairly stagnant from 1066 to the time of the Reformation in the 1500s. Nice cherry picking of data there in those two parts. The reason for this, he argued, though, was that there were too many celibate priests and monks in England, and they weren't running around having children. Now, there are a lot of reasons why the comparison is a poor one, not the least of which being that a lot of the growth in the U.S. population at that time was due to Catholic immigration from Ireland, Italy, and other parts of Europe. Draper knew about immigration because he was against it. He felt that bringing in people from these Catholic countries was creating a hybrid population and not a purely Protestant one. So there's that. Amazing enough, however, a few of his arguments are still believed by many people today. For example, have you ever heard that everyone thought the world was flat until Columbus discovered America? Well, that's a lie. We have known since the time of Aristotle that the world is round. But Draper included it in his book and it became part of the popular culture and is still there for many people. All right, enough about Draper. How about the other book? It was called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. It was a 2-volume book by Andrew Dickson White and was published in 1896. White was a Yale graduate and a successful businessman in upstate New York. In 1863, he was elected to the state Senate. He came up with a scheme to take state money that had been earmarked for land-grant colleges, all of which had religious affiliations, and allocate it instead for the creation of a secular college that he would get to be president of. Now, to get all this through the state legislature, he needed somebody that was a real mover and shaker. And he found one, a guy named Ezra Cornell. Needless to say, he got the money and the job, and the school was named after Cornell. And so today, Cornell is the only Ivy League college that does not have any religious connection to its founding. As you may imagine, he took a lot of criticism for what he did. And his book was a response. He argued that the fight his critics had with him was not about dirty politics, but it was about the fight between religion and science. To oppose what he did was to oppose the advancement of science, not dirty politics. And it should be noted that his fight was with all religion, not just the Catholic Church, although oddly enough, he is buried in the Cornell University chapel. All right. So if you take the side of science in the war between science and religion, you might enjoy these books. But what I want to show you now is that the war they describe never happened. Both books were just pure propaganda. And to really show this, we need to go back a lot further. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe sank into feudalism and constant warfare. The only thing that united the people in any regard was religion. Education and the production of books was preserved in the monasteries. And then as the times improved, we entered the era of the great cathedral building. And most of the cathedrals included schools. They were the only places of formal education in all of Europe. And these schools became very popular, and as more people could afford to send their children to them, the schools outgrew the space of the cathedrals. And so they became established as separate and independent universities. Here are a few of the early ones. In 1088, we saw the founding of the University of Bologna in Italy. 1096, Oxford University in England. 1134, the University of Salamanca in Spain. In 1150, the University of Paris in France. 1209, Cambridge University in England. And 1224, the University of Naples in Italy. These are just some of the early schools. And among the subjects, the four main topics that the schools taught were philosophy, theology, medicine, and law. And later, the highest degree in each of these was a Juris Doctor, or JD, in law, an MD in medicine, a THD in theology, a theological doctor, and a PhD in philosophy, a philosophical doctor. And in an odd bit of history, as the natural sciences developed, they were at first seen as subspecialties within philosophy. So even today, if you're in the highest degree in any science like physics or biology, mathematics, etc., you are awarded a PhD. And the physical piece of paper, the degree that you're given, actually says you are a doctor of philosophy. Interesting bit of history there. All right. There's a reason why education in the universities grew up in the Christian West. Catholic doctrine believes that the universe that God created is good. In Genesis 1, at each step of creation, God reminds us it was good. And not only is it good, but it's structured the way it is on purpose, and that the creation reflects the Creator. So, to understand nature is to get a better understanding of God Himself. Added to that is the fact that humans are the only species on Earth with the capacity for reason and logic. So, it's reasonable to conclude that God wants us to use that capability in deepening our understanding of creation and our faith. If you've already listened to episode 2 of this podcast, this is part of believing in epistemological realism. There is absolute truth, and both faith and science are working to understand it from different perspectives. So let's contrast this with other religions. Let's look at Buddhism. Buddhism argues that our perception of the material universe is fraught with desire and suffering. So the core path of spiritual growth is the principle that we must detach from the natural world and not be involved in it. All right, take Islam. The primary school of theology today in Islam is the Asharite school. And it argues that God is so absolute that there are no natural laws for God to adhere to. Because if God was to adhere to a natural law, then God is somehow diminished. Instead, everything is according to God's will at every moment in time. Therefore, there is no natural law, only the revelation that God chooses to give. You can know nothing apart from God's revelation. Okay, that's Islam. You can look at the philosophical system of Plato in ancient Greece, where the material world was seen as being inferior and corrupt to the spiritual one. For example, today, if you believe that when you die, your soul goes to heaven, your body doesn't matter anymore, so you don't care what happens to your body, that belief is more consistent with Plato than it is to Christianity. In fact, in the Apostles' Creed, we say we believe in the resurrection of the body. And the role of the body is important, but we'll save that for another podcast. So, this Catholic idea that nature is good and helps us to understand God has always contributed to the advancement in science. Would you like some proof? Here are several examples of how profound this is and continues to be. Let's start with a man named Alfred the Great. Lived 1200 to 1280, and he was a German Dominican friar. He's also a doctor of the church, which is a very formal title and very important. He was also the mentor of Thomas Aquinas. He was a profound theologian, but he also made advances in logic, botany, geography, astronomy, zoology, physiology, justice, and law. In fact, Albert the Great is credited with the first scientific and systematic study of minerals. Let's go forward a little bit to Nicholas Copernicus, lived 1473 to 1543. He lived in what is now Poland. He had a doctorate in canon law, and his day job was as canon for the Warmian Cathedral. He came up with the theory that the sun was at the center of the universe and not the earth. This began what we now refer to as the Copernican Revolution, and it was one of the first major steps in the scientific revolution. And then we have Robert Boyle, lived 1627 to 1691 and was an Englishman. He's the founder of modern chemistry, and he played a key role in developing the scientific method. He strongly believed that science could contribute to our understanding of the faith, so much so that he was offered ordination in the Church of England, but he turned it down because he believed he could make a bigger contribution to theology as a layman. So many came to refer to him as a lay bishop. Isaac Newton lived 1643 to 1727, also an Englishman. He established the classical model of mechanics, which unified several branches of physics. This included the laws of motion and planetary gravitation. He invented calculus, simultaneous to and independent of Leibniz. He also made great advances in optics. But what you may not know is he also wrote extensively on theology, but much of his theological work wasn't published until after he died. Like Boyle, he too was offered ordination in the Church of England, but turned it down, fearing that it would take too much time and focus away from his other work. Next, we have Gregor Mendel. He lived 1822 to 1884 and was from Austria. He was an abbot of an Augustinian monastery, meaning he was the head monk of the monastery. He conducted many botanical experiments, and his results were so significant that he is credited with being the father of modern genetics. When we talk about dominant or recessive genes, those are terms he coined. Let's move forward. Georges Lemaitre lived 1894 to 1966. He was a priest from Belgium and was also a mathematician and physicist. When Edwin Hubble, for whom the Hubble Space Telescope is named, observed that there is a red shift in the light from stars, meaning that they're traveling away from each other, Lemaitre used the Einstein field equations from general relativity to argue that the expanding universe shows that it was once much more compact. And in fact, his math led to the idea that it once was so compact that it started from a single point. His critics mocked him and called that moment the Big Bang. The name stuck, and the Big Bang theory came from a Catholic priest/physicist. Ironically, most of his critics didn't like the theory because they were people who believed that the universe had always existed, and that his theory was a way of trying to sneak the Christian idea of creation into science. Oddly enough, people today argue that the Big Bang theory is proof that God doesn't exist. But of course, for them to argue that, they have no clue about its history. Now ask yourself this. If you didn't already know that the Big Bang theory was developed by a Catholic priest, then ask yourself, why isn't that being taught? I'll give you a final example of Mary Kenneth Keller. She lived from 1913 to 1985 and was from Ohio, an American. In 1932, she became a nun of the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In 1965, she was the first person to earn a PhD in a very new field of study. And that field was computer science. Most people in early computing were mathematicians. When they developed a separate discipline and a separate doctoral program, she was the first one to complete it. Got the first PhD in computer science. She took that degree and established and ran the computer science department at Clark University in Iowa, an all-girls college run by her order. And let me ask you this. If you see yourself as a feminist and don't already know that the first person to earn a PhD in computer science was a woman and a nun, then you must ask yourself, why isn't this being taught? So here are 7 enormously important Christians that made an enormously important contributions to science. And they spread out over an 800-year period to today. I could keep going, but I hope I've made my point. And have no doubt, that list is continuing to grow today. One of my favorite places is the work of the Vatican Observatory and the advances in astrophysics that are taking place there. But as you listen to all this, you might be thinking in the back of your mind, but what about Galileo? Wasn't he fighting the church? Wasn't he arrested by the church? Wasn't his fight with the church proof that the church was anti-science? If you don't know the story of Galileo, that's worth looking up. He was a genius, no doubt, and that caused him to draw the conclusion that everyone else was stupid, and he was all too happy to tell them. His fight with the church was over his obnoxious behavior and his refusal to play well with others, not his work on the Copernican model of physics. Copernicus was a churchman, and no one complained about his work. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself this: how many other scientists has the church gone to war with? Hard to come up with any. Galileo is a weird case, but not a good one to build an argument out of against science and religion. So, if we don't have a war between religion and science, how can we see them working together? Well, I'm glad you asked. The church has answered this question. One of the things that popes do is publish documents called papal encyclicals. They are a pastoral letter, or more like an academic paper to bishops on specific topics. They're written in Latin and then translated into the various languages of the world. They're usually referred to by their Latin names. They can be quite technical, but they often set the tone for a conversation, not only within the church, but also within the wider society. Also, they are not typically written in chapters, but rather in paragraphs. So when you reference one, you reference it by its paragraph number. Every encyclical ever written can be found on the Vatican's website, and I have a link on the allroadsleadtorome.net website as well to show you where they are. For example, Rerum Novarum was published in 1891 and set the tone for the modern Catholic understanding of Catholic social teaching. If you'll read it, you'll come to see how Catholic social teaching does not map onto the American political approaches of left and right. It's much more nuanced and developed than that. Pacem in Terris was published in 1963 and was a profound call for peace during the Cold War. It set the vision for a divine order, for human rights, and for the common good. Humanae Vitae was published in 1968 and focused on human sexuality, contraception, and the dignity of human life. And there are many others. Today, we'll look at a bit at Fides et Ratio, which is Latin for faith and reason. It was written by John Paul II in 1998. It's 45 pages long, it's single-spaced, and it has no pictures. It's a very intense read. Well, what's the fundamental argument? It's laid out in paragraph 1. Quote, "The more human beings know reality in the world, the more they know themselves in their uniqueness, with the question of the meaning of things and their very existence becoming ever more pressing," end quote. The more we know the world, the better we understand of what it means to be human. In our day, We seem trapped in the notion that technology governs our lives. We just sit on our phones doom scrolling every chance we get. Fides et Ratio argues that science and technology exist to help the human race become more human. It also argues that philosophy plays the same role because it asks the questions about life's meaning and uses reason and logic to wrestle with the answers. In fact, the word philosophy comes from a Greek word meaning lover of wisdom. Now, we're meant to approach the questions of life with wonder. Our technology can make boring or difficult tasks easier, but that is meant to free us up to engage in the contemplation of the deeper questions of meaning in life. Instead of doing that, the free time technology has given us is being used by many to look to our technology to give us that meaning. And the data shows that this is failing miserably. The more time people spend on social media, the more likely they are deeply depressed. The more time people spend online seeking entertainment, the more lethargic and bored they become. So, we need to find ways to use it better. Just as science understands how nature works, philosophy focuses on the nature of nature, its existence, its function, its purpose, and so on. When you add this to theology, this study of how God reveals himself to us and how we are to live our lives, we get a full picture, not only of our relationship with God, but also of our relationship with God's creation. Because of this, theology, science, and good philosophy cannot contradict each other. Let me say that again. Theology, science, and good philosophy cannot contradict each other. They are all part of a beautiful whole that reveals to us more of God. When there's an obvious conflict between two of them, the task is to find resolution to the confusion. For example, many conservative Protestants believe in the literal 6 days of creation and the idea that the universe is just 6,000 years old. Yet, from at least the time of Augustine 1,600 years ago, Catholics have known that Genesis 1 is talking about something far deeper than mere history. It shows us what our human nature is and how we corrupt it. So our understanding of creation does not conflict with a scientific one. But the church does offer challenges to aspects of scientific theories of creation. As the encyclical states, quote, "The knowledge proper to faith does not destroy the mystery. It only reveals it the more, showing how necessary it is for people's lives," end quote. So, we can study evolution to get a better understanding of history, and at the same time study Genesis to get a better understanding of what it means to be human and what kind of existence God calls us to. And that's all spelled out in paragraph 13. As I said, the encyclical is 45 pages. It goes through the history of Christian thinking on these matters from the beginning of the church and how each generation used scripture, philosophy, and the natural sciences to deepen its understanding and to build on the generations that came before. It's a beautiful retelling of how faith and reason have brought us closer to God. But if you try to make your way through this encyclical, I'll warn you, it assumes a knowledge of both natural logic related to philosophy and God's revelation in theology. If you don't understand philosophy or theology, this is going to be a very tough read. So, faith and reason are not in competition with each other. They are not, and they never have been. Each has its own scope, and each connects to the other in complementary ways. This is the key failure of Draper and White's books. Their core premise is that the two are in competition and incompatible, and completely ignores all of history. And lots of people today still assume that this is true. Well, after all this, hopefully you're still with me on this. Everything I've just described fits into a model that is now called classical theism. Very important term, classical theism. And as clear as it is, I'm sad to say that today philosophy has been going in a very different direction. Starting with René Descartes, famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." Since him, it has focused less and less on the pursuit of truth And today, as expressed in postmodernism, it doubts that there is anything that is ultimately true at all. And worse than that, as Fide Ratio says in paragraph 107, quote, different philosophical systems have lured people into believing that they are their own absolute master, able to decide their own destiny and future in complete autonomy, trusting only in themselves and their own powers. But this can never be the grandeur of the human being, who can find fulfillment only in choosing to enter the truth, to make a home under the shade of wisdom, and to dwell there. End quote. Or, as we read in another encyclical, Dei Filius, which gets quoted in paragraph 53, even if faith is superior to reason, there can never be a true divergence between faith and reason, since the same God who reveals the mysteries and bestows the gift of faith has also placed in the human spirit the light of reason. This God could not deny himself, nor could the truth ever contradict the truth, end quote. That's paragraph 53, quoting from Dei Filius. Many students of philosophy today, and many professors of philosophy, do fall into the category of classical theism, despite where postmodernism has taken everyone else. Peter Kreeft, a philosopher at Boston College, is one of the best known. His writings are extensive and profound. The same is true for John Cuddeback of Christendom College in Virginia. Also, there is an organization called the Thomistic Institute, which is run by the Order of Dominicans, the same order that Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas belonged to. They have chapters on college campuses all over the country that teach classical theism. Many of the lectures given at these chapters are posted as podcast episodes by the Thomistic Institute. I highly recommend you find that podcast and listen to these. They have an enormous library of lectures on a whole range of topics within classical theism, and it's just truly fascinating and educational. Now, sadly, when I was in high school and college, I thought philosophy just wrestled with the existence of God. I concluded that since I already knew God existed, I didn't need philosophy. But in 2022, when I was received into the church, I wanted to read the Summa Theologia of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's perhaps the most comprehensive theological text ever written. It's over 6,000 pages long. But I really struggled to follow his logic because I had no training in the philosophical concepts and style that he used. So I ended up taking 3 online courses, one on the history of philosophy, one on Socrates and Plato, and one on Aristotle and Aquinas, and read a lot of books. Once I completed those, I then spent the next year reading the Summa, and it was astounding in its depth and meaning. One of the greatest intellectual journeys of my life. Now, as we start to wrap up today, there are 2 technical terms that are worth knowing to describe the phenomenon of people swinging from one extreme to the other on this whole science and religion discussion. The first is called scientism. It's a belief in science that has no limits. It actually argues that the only reality we can ever experience is what we learn from science, which is actually a self-refuting concept because there is no law, theory, or equation that argues that science is the only way to grasp reality. So putting all of your eggs in the science basket is called scientism. The opposite extreme is called fideism. F-I-D-E-I-S-M. Fideism. Fideism argues that the only truths worth knowing come from faith. Science is to be distrusted. Of course, when you look to the Bible to give answers to everything, including scientific questions, everything in Scripture gets compressed into an undifferentiated mass. And when you do that, you lose the ability to distinguish between the different and various types of literature contained in the Bible. You can no longer tell the difference between a poem and a police report. And if you have engaged in any meaningful Bible study, you know that there are poems, there are parables, there are historical retellings, there's prophecy, and on and on. In fideism, you lose the ability to distinguish the differences between them. So, where is the general culture today? It's mired in postmodernism. It's full of skepticism, doubt, and a crushing sense of hopelessness because it has squeezed all meaning out of life. Our culture is filled with people who are desperately lonely and lost. And because of that, postmodernism is already collapsing on itself. Humanity and existence have become incoherent. So how should Catholics approach faith and reason in that environment? There needs to be a commitment to both. As John Paul II wrote, quote, "Faith and reason are like two wings which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth." End quote. Okay, so pay attention because this is what will be on the test. Faith and reason have always worked together. Some modern propaganda has tried to say that this isn't true, but I've given you a list of people that show over an 800-year period that it is true. They have worked together. John Paul II wrote a papal encyclical called Fides et Ratio in 1998 to help us remember how faith and reason must go together. And today, when you encounter people that only believe in science and say there's no other way to truth, that's called scientism. And when you encounter people who argue that the only way to truth is through faith, that's called fideism. The two sides of a bad coin. God's creation is so much bigger and more interesting. And you can gain a much deeper understanding of this through the study of classical theism in the Catholic Church. Pursue that truth, because it is the meaning of the true journey of discovery in life. And if you do this, I promise you, you will make an amazing discovery. And that discovery is, all roads lead to Rome.